right, I'm going to do 3 things in this next hour. It's sort of a brief period of time. It's late in the day. You've been flooded with fascinating, inspiring, interesting things. So I'm going to try to keep it simple. But the first thing, I'm just going to give you a little of my own background. And I was able to work with Tim Keller on the book Every Good Endeavor. So I'm going to run through a little bit of the main ideas there and how I just speak about it with people. And then thirdly, we're going to go through a classic way that faith and work ministry is often done in churches and analyze and dissect that a little bit for your sake. So those are the 3 goals of the time. I will try to have some interaction so that I'm not doing more talking at you. But let's just open in a prayer briefly here. Dear Lord, I'm so grateful for the words that Pete just gave us. And Lord, we just invite you into our hearts right now, into this room, and in particular to every minute of the work we do or the plans we do for our work. Convict us, inspire us, and give us glimpses of your kingdom as we work. In your Son's name, amen. All right, so a little bit of my background. I didn't become a Christian until I was 40-ish, and it was at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And prior to that, I'd been in high tech, my 20s and 30s. And at the point that I became a Christian at Redeemer, I also became president of the small 150-person company that I had been leading. And that was such a fluke. It was such a, unexpected, off-the-wall experience that I wasn't quite sure what being a Christian was about, but I thought if God speaks to you and calls you to a work, he sure does it with a 2x4. It was that kind of a juxtaposition of timing and that kind of an experience, which of course then led to the obvious question of, so what does that mean? What does it mean that he's called someone to lead in a particular area? How do you do that for him differently or whatever? And I was clueless. I was clueless how to be a president of a company, and I was clueless how to be a Christian. So that led a several decades long search into answering those questions. What I heard, what I generally picked up out there in talking to people was, firstly business people who are Christians, was you put a Bible on your desk and people will ask you questions, or you have a crisis and you will pray and God will bless you and turn the crisis into some wonderful prosperity. I mean, that was about what I was picking up as I was out in the world. And so that just didn't seem anywhere near deep enough or rich enough. And I don't know how many of you became Christians later in life, but I'm thinking, I've given up a lot here, and if it's just about a Bible on my desk, that's just not nearly deep enough or rich enough. After a couple of years doing that in New York, I ended up moving to California, Silicon Valley, and becoming a CEO of 2 different companies out there. And each time feeling like I was growing a wee bit in my faith, but quite honestly, with the challenge of learning how to lead a company at the same time that I was trying to grow in faith, I felt like I gave leading the company the first priority, and growing in my faith was just sort of a clinging to God in a sort of lame kind of way, I guess. And that last company failed. And at that point, I was really wrestling with God. And how can you call somebody to something and then fail? How can God, what is this whole idea of calling? And I found Regent College up in Vancouver. And, they do this really great thing for people who work. They do 1-week-long classes. So I went up there and had a theology of work class. And I thought, every pastor I've heard seems to have been holding out on me. I mean, there's all this like rich, deep stuff. And, sometimes you go to church and all you hear is, well, just make sure you are home in time to have dinner with your family. Or just make sure you have there was so much more. So that led to this quest to try to understand the deeper resources of our faith that could dig into this in some way. I was planning to go back into another business kind of a role, and Redeemer called and said, would you be willing to move back to New York to help us start a marketplace ministry, which I was not willing to do. But God sort of grabs you and eventually convicted me on how much I had complained that the church wasn't doing enough to help in this area. And so sometimes, when you complain enough about something, he says, well, this is what I'm calling you to. So I eventually agreed to go back there and do that. And that ministry was really focused around this deep quest of trying to understand, how does the gospel really change you? How does it change your heart for your work? How does it change the relationships that you have in work? And how does it, through your work, change the culture or the society in which we live? So a focus on the power of the gospel for change. And that became our mantra was, the gospel changes everything. It changes our hearts, it changes our relationship, and it changes the world. We focused on 3 areas: theology, getting a deep grounding in not just scripture here and there, but the overarching understanding of the storyline of the Bible and the doctrine that can flow out of that. We focused on spiritual formation, so a lot of what Pete was talking about up there. How do we shape our hearts toward God when, especially people the marketplace is where we're drawn the most into the ways and the thinking and the values of the world. So it's really where we need to be fighting the most to be grounded into the truths of the biblical storyline. So I led that ministry for about 10 years, sort of retired, and went down to Raleigh, North Carolina, started another similar faith and work ministry down there, and then just recently have gone back to New York to try to help cast a vision for the next several years of faith and work ministry, in particular how Redeemer City to City can help equip other churches around the globe in other cities for this kind of ministry. So that's sort of the flow of my background from which I'm speaking. After about 10 years, Tim Keller was ready to write on this area of faith and work, and it was really a great experience to work with him on that, because it's a book that flows out of that 10 years of on-the-ground ministry. It's as we tested, what kind of needs did people have, and where were their struggles, and what was the theology that was really going to resonate, where they just go, aha, and this really changed how I looked at everything. The book really is attempting to put that all into one place, and nobody can pack more ideas into a book than Tim Keller. And I tried to make them all fit together in a readable kind of a way. But it's a privilege to be able to work on that, and hence that's the topic for today. So the first thing I want to do is ask you to share with a partner some job that you've had that has not been inside a church, not paid work inside a church, but some job that you've had. And I'd like you to explain to your partner what was good about that job. Just what was good about it? Simple question. What was broken about it? And how did you deal with the brokenness? So 3 simple questions. So I'm only going to give you enough time to tell your partner that very quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to share some of what you had. So find one other person to say hello first. Say your name.
Sure, yeah. Well, I honestly only had one of the jobs I was like a customer service personality. So I guess what was good was I got to interact with a lot of people. You had a lot of guys very much people were like very mean and right. What was broken? Oh no, at least I feel like in my case, like it was I was mature most of the time I did it. Part of the thing was that like part of my job was like I was stuck like making a lot of sales and like people are calling to pay their bills and I was trying to get them to the left. You know what I'm saying? So it felt every interaction felt very transactional in the sense that it was everything was really super nice. So like I was nice to you or whatever, but I had no even agenda. So everyone just was like somebody calls like I don't know, like I had a car, like change the car, so like it's like oh maybe you can pay. So I don't know, like that was probably like the most frustrating part about it, and how I dealt with it is quit. I just really wait to finish it. So yeah, I could in retrospect I feel like I didn't have the perspective back then.
One more minute.
Like I was doing, sorry.
I was in local ballet for a while.
Yeah.
It was got to interact with a lot of
So one of you guys can be an example for me? All right, let's see what we have. So I'm going to call on a few of you. It's good to actually talk to each other a little bit, right? I'm going to call on a few of you. I'd like to hear you just run through it. Say something about the job and then run through these three areas. So one of you three? Yeah. All right, nice and loud so everyone can hear you.
Ultra Seminary, I catered for a wedding venue.
Okay.
It was good for the season, the work. Good in that we're serving others. I think broken in that it was, we kind of just tried to please, whatever the bride wanted, we tried to please the bride. And
Very careful what you say.
Pleasing everyone else was kind of like, it was kind of like.
It was messy?
Yeah.
Multiple customers?
Well,
is that the?
No, well, quick example. I spilled champagne on a person who was there, and our director said, was it the bride or anyone in the family? I said, I don't know. She's like, okay, we're fine then. so that was, something we had to wrestle through, kind of who we.
I'm not quite sure how to write it. I'll write pleasing customers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then actually, that was kind of a turning point. When she said that struck me, and I thought, what if I started to think about everyone as if I'm treating them like the bride?
So there's a little aha there.
Yeah.
So I'll say change, all pleased, kind of thing. So that's neat. Little transformation there. How about you guys? Yeah.
In my mid-20s, I worked for Target.
Okay.
As an executive manager. And the good thing is it put me in contact with a lot of people and a good team and a good environment generally. And gave me a lot of influence there. The broken part was that I was selling some things that I didn't think we should sell, particularly in music, movies, and books. romance novels. Some of the music was very dark, and so I really wrestled with that. Because I was responsible for that department.
Right.
And ultimately, it ate on my conscience so much that I felt like because I was in such a large organization, and I didn't feel like I had much say over that, I did end up leaving.
All right. So your way of dealing with it was to quit and move on in that context. Somebody else. I just need two more. Yes.
So I work for an architecture and construction firm. We design and build churches, and so we have highly talented, very diverse teams. So it's pulling together people from such a variety of disciplines, and all using their gifts in a different way to serve the church. But it requires a lot of trust in those teams. Someone else's mistake influences the work that you receive as it's passed down the pipeline. So it's broken trust and the impact of that kind of anxiety on executing the project. So kind of in the process of dealing with that right now, we're bringing in outside consultants to coach our project leaders through how to deal with anxiety and how to lead from your own seat, whatever that might be on the project.
Wow. All right. That's it. Are most of the people in the firm Christian?
Probably most.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's a creative resolution to that. I mean, it could also be power wins. There's all kinds of resolutions here that are not as helpful as working on building trust and releasing anxiety. So thank you. One more. Yeah.
I worked at Caterpillar.
Okay.
So a large corporate organization. But I felt in general the culture there was pretty good, people-oriented. We built a community. We felt a part of something bigger than ourselves. And we did good work. But it was broken in that I don't think people felt very motivated to do anything beyond what was minimally required. And I guess unless there was some monetary incentive, there really wasn't much of an incentive for us to go beyond just what we were being asked to do. And so I dealt with it by trying to work harder myself and kind of trying to pull everyone with me. But when a 20-year-old can only pull so many people who have been there for 20 plus years already, so it was instructive. And then I couldn't change the people around me by myself.
All alone, yeah. It didn't get you in trouble trying to work harder?
My boss kept telling me to stop. She said, I don't have anything for you. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, just sit there and relax. I was like, that's not working. So
yeah.
I had to deal with feeling bad about that too, or not feeling bad about that.
Yeah. When I was a teacher right out of college, I was just sweeping the classroom because it was pretty disgusting, and I was trying to get the kids to sit on the floor to read books and stuff, and I was reprimanded for doing work outside of the scope of a classroom teacher. So sometimes you can actually get in trouble for dealing with the brokenness if it's outside of your scope. So I use this model for a lot of reasons. First of all, one of the things I hear from pastors a lot is I don't really know how to talk to people about their work. I don't understand what somebody's doing if they're in finance or they work for Caterpillar or they work in technology. And there's no easier framework in the world than this one. I asked you to pick an example of work outside the church, just make it simpler. But certainly this all applies to the church as well. There's no simpler framework for a conversation. You can do it with anyone. What's good about your work? What's broken? And how are you resolving the tension of that brokenness? And where I think we need a lot of work is understanding what's good in terms that are not just what feels good to me, what makes me happy, but aligning that goodness with a deeper understanding of what God thinks is good. And then secondly, same with the brokenness. in general, when we complain about our work, it's what's broken that affects me, that makes me unhappy when I go in at the end of the day. Our scope tends to be very small. So how do we line this up with our understanding of sin in the world, and have eyes to see it beyond what makes us feel uncomfortable? Part 2 of this brokenness is, where is my brokenness contributing to the brokenness of this environment? So when I'm the one that doesn't want to do more than I get paid for, is my brokenness contributing to that environment? Or when I'm the one who's complaining about my management, am I the one that's contributing to this brokenness? So there's a whole, a vast array of things that we can explore as Christians in the brokenness of the world around us, but also the brokenness inside us. And then this may even be the biggest area that we need to work with. In our culture, I think today, this is the predominant solution. Quitting, fantasizing about quitting, fantasizing about retiring, some version of checking out, leaving a way out is probably the primary way that we think about dealing with the brokenness. So I was quite impressed that some of you had some actual solutions to deal with that tension that were a little bit more optimistic, more filled with hope, more God-glorifying than that, to bring in some, to recognize the depth of the problem and bring in some coaching to help that, or to have an awareness yourself that says, I'm learning a lesson here. The brokenness is teaching me something about the brokenness in myself. Are some really great responses there. So one reason for me laying this out is just so there's no easier thing to talk about with people than this area, and then linking them to a deeper theology. The second is, this is the flow that we used for every good endeavor. And I'm going to get some help, hopefully, in passing these out. I have some on this side. Can you help me on this side? I can't give you much of that in this time, but I want to highlight a few. I gave you an outline because I think the outline's actually pretty easy, pretty instructive and constructive. Part 1, God's plan for work. Part 2, our problems with work. And Part 3, basically redemption of work, hope for new work in light of the gospel. Oh, thank you. Everybody got one? So I'm just going to highlight a few of these on page 1. I'm not doing justice to this full theology, but let me highlight a few. The dignity of work. That's my chapter 2 there, the dignity of work. And I want to talk about that for 2 reasons. One is the changes culturally, moving from a more industrialization kind of job market economy to a technology-based robotics kind of economy. There's a lot of need for people who are paying attention to the way work gives us dignity as human beings. So it's probably an area that should just be on your radar as something to be really reading about, digging into. The second is, because I think a lot of you are in a leadership role in some way, and I want to talk about the dignity of delegation. A lot of younger people, which is mostly who I've worked with in New York and in Raleigh, people in their 20s starting out in their career, are really miserable in their jobs. Even if it's a great job, they've got all kinds of great degrees. And one of the reasons they're miserable is they're doing grunt work. They're doing spreadsheets. They're doing some sort of routine activity that's not requiring a lot of their capabilities, their giftedness, their college education training. And a lot of that's because we as leaders aren't very good at delegating. There's a great book by a Fortune 500 CEO named, former Fortune 500 CEO named Dennis Bakke, published about 15 years ago, called Joy at Work. And he actually, throughout his entire company, had a philosophy of always pushing down decision-making as far as it could go. He had structures around that. You know, you wouldn't just let some young punk right out of college make a decision that could, destroy the company's future. There was structure. He had to prove that he went to a set of experts in the company and got good input and tested his ideas. But it was his decision. Once he'd gone through this process, so he was really training people at the lowest level of the company how to make decisions, so that as they went up the line, they would be able to be better and better at making decisions. It also gave them a far greater sense of ownership of the work that they were doing. And his point theologically is God made us to have some agency, to have some authority over the work we're doing. And the more we as leaders can give that, can share that. And so I had the opportunity to meet him. I'd read his book and taught from it quite a few classes. And I had a chance to meet with him and said, so Dennis, I get all this importance of delegating, but sometimes when I'm there and I'm at the top of the organization, there's a really big decision, I look around and think, I've paid my dues to make this decision. It's my turn to be able to make this decision. I can make this decision better. I don't care how many structures. I still will make a better decision than that lower level person. And he said, yeah, we all go through that. He said, so what do you think God did in Genesis 1 and 2? When he delegated naming the animals to man, and when he delegated cultivating these awesome resources that he built into our earth, you don't think he knew that he could have done a better job at it than we did? And yet, because we were made in his image, he believed it was important for our humanness, for our living into the imago Dei, being made like him, for us to be able to make decisions, have agency, participate in this grand cultivation project in this world that he put us in. So that was an aha conversation for me, a life changer. It's like, all right, there's reasons to do this that honor God, that give God glory, independent. I mean, obviously you've got to make your institution strong and not let it run amok with poor delegation. But you've got to do everything you can to set up people that are junior to you to be able to make decisions and learn and grow and have agency in that area. It's part of the dignity of work. I think I took too long on that point. I am sorry. Well, third, I'll go quickly. Just work as cultivation. This quote on the second bullet there, culture making with God. I love this definition of our role, our opportunity to cultivate. It's rearranging the raw material of God's creation in a way that helps the world and it helps its people thrive and flourish. So that's what we're really doing as we're an entrepreneur, as we're working in some aspect of bringing even a new system or organization or leadership structure into our company. We're rearranging the raw materials in some way that will add to greater flourishing. So I just wanted to point that to out for your attention. Part 2, our problems with work. I love this section. And I think maybe my work has been so pointless and so fruitless that I just need to really be able to acknowledge that from time to time. But because of the world outside us that's broken, we're told there's going to be lots of thorns and thistles in our work. It is fruitless some of the time. It's meaningless some of the time. That's just a fact. the myth of the American world that we and our young people are growing up in is that somehow everything's supposed to be perfect. Everything's supposed to be an ideal situation, and I'll walk into an organization and my leader will be amazing, and all my colleagues will be the best and the brightest and the most honest and capable. And every time there's a wrinkle in that, we're like, oh, horror, fallenness. We have such a low expectation of brokenness. And, I don't know quite how that got into our cultural juice, but as Christians, we need to be able to know we're called into brokenness. Our job isn't to go find the most comfortable job. Our job is, God actually calls us into His troop to go and walk into the most broken parts of the world and broken institutions in our culture. So our expectation has to be for thorns and thistles. Therefore, we need to be good at seeing glimpses of Him at work there, or it gets overly discouraging. But we need an expectation shift. And then on the next page, our work becomes selfish. So this is where our brokenness contributes. I don't think I've had lots and lots of groups by vocation where, from dancers to finance people to educators to, I don't think I've had a single person ever come in and say, I contributed to the brokenness of my work environment today. I don't think how often have you gone home, looked in the mirror and said, it was actually my idol of recognition that contributed to the brokenness today? We just don't do that. But we need to look at ourselves. We need to, the classic divide of, we've got several dualisms going on here in this faith work thing, but one of them is the us versus them of Christians versus the non-Christians. And so you often will be in a workplace group of Christians saying, well, those people are bringing sin into my workplace. There's rarely, wow, that sin goes through me and it goes through them. And sometimes I'm bringing more into it, or the Christians are bringing more into it than the non-Christians are bringing into it. We've got a faulty theology when it comes to that. So I think our ministry has actually spent a lot of time on this, our own brokenness piece. A lot of how do we understand where our motives are really off? A lot of what Pete Scazzaro talked about earlier. How are we addicted to our own sort of anger, or our own fears, or our own deep desires that we're so convinced are okay because they're us, that we don't even notice them anymore, but we bring them into that workplace. It ties in with conversations about social justice and racism, and when you don't really know how deeply ingrained your sense of privilege is, or you don't know how deeply ingrained your anger is over lack of privilege, but you bring that brokenness in without even examining it. So I think it's important in faith and work ministry to spend a lot of time on the idolatries. And then third, moving to, so then what's the hope? What's the gospel bring to us? And I just want to focus on two of those for this moment. One is a new story for work. So that, I don't think you can do faith and work ministry without going into the storyline from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. That we're made to work, and then that entire story of for the purpose of giving glimpses of that kingdom to come that is promised, assured, is totally going to happen. And so that first Obama campaign that was entirely on hope, and you just kept wanting to say, what is the hope based on? I mean, I love it. Hope. We all need a lot more hope. But our world, I guess, talks about hope like Trulia talked this morning about the way we talk about love. It's just a Hallmark card. And we need to be the ones that are bringing a reason for hope, a tangibility to hope into this story of why we're working and what we're doing. And then the power for work. I'm just going to talk about one piece of that because it's been important in my wrestling with God. This whole scripture about my yoke is easy. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's just not resonated a lot in my work life. And yet it's there. So, how do we wrestle? I want the folks in our ministry to wrestle that to the ground. And the best I can understand it so far is the reason our yoke isn't easy is because we yoke ourselves to so many other idols. And we want to say, all right, Jesus, I'm yoked to you, but you don't mind if I carry these 4,000 pounds of other idolatries along with me. And so I think just to re-emphasize what Pete ended with, we need our Sabbaths to unyoke from all those idols that we think we need for our identity in work. And honestly, work is like this Pandora's box of idolatries. Churches that don't do discipleship in this area of work are missing. It's like you're just looking at this tiny little set of idols that come out when people go to church. Work just opens up this whole huge box of idols that you get to drill down on, and we just can't ignore it. It's too big. It's too powerful. So that's my really fast run through every good endeavor, and the core, the flow of how we do faith and work ministry in the 15 years that I've been working on it. Next, turn the page to Faith and Work Integration Matrix. So about a decade ago, David Miller did his doctoral thesis on the history of the faith and work movement. At that time, there were very few churches doing faith and work, but there were a lot of parachurch kinds of ministries. Some of you may be involved in those kinds of things. So a businessman's ministry or a CEO's ministry or a lawyer's ministry or a dentist and doctor's ministry, those kinds of things. So he sort of looked back at the last 50 years and said they tend to fall into 4 categories. And maybe I can, while I'm drawing on the board, I can get 4 readers. Can you read the first category and second and third and fourth? And they're all starting with an E because he's a business guy and we're really simple. We need lots of mnemonics. So, okay. Can you read that while I...
Sure.
Nice and loud, yeah.
Ethics. Attention to personal virtue, business ethics, and broader questions of social and economic justice. Recognizing that work is part of God's created order, we therefore attempt to do it in ethical, moral, and just ways. Neither categorize ethics in terms of the right, the good, and the fitting.
Evangelism emphasizes living out the Great Commission and being a winsome witness and disciple to those who do not know the gospel. In the faith work context, this can mean many kinds of behaviors, ranging from being overtly persuasive about the goodness of the gospel to praying behind the scenes for those we work with.
Experience, or calling and purpose. Attention to the intrinsic and extrinsic meaning and purpose of the work we are called to do. The search for meaning and enjoyment of the work we do can be pressing throughout a career and ties to our understanding that God created us for a purpose and gave us unique gifts, circumstances, and experience to suit that purpose. This area involves greater self-knowledge and greater knowledge of God and His work in the world.
Enrichment accents God's power to restore, nurture, bless, and transform us in our work. The focus tends to be inward with practices such as prayer, meditation, fasting, healing, and support groups to draw nearer to God and His power.
Thank you. So my question is, go to the next page. I want you to draw your experience of faith and work integration. Where are you the strongest? If you're strong, put your X out on the 5 point. If you're weak, put it down on the 1 point. Which of these 4 areas, ethics, enrichment, evangelism, calling and purpose, do you feel like you've done the best job at faith and work integration in? And then when you finish that, make yourself a nice little kite, whatever that might look like. Just looking to see the relative weight your life has had on each of those quadrants. Yeah. Thank you. These are all going to look nice and different. Thank you. Good, thank you. I don't have a 4th color, so I'm not sure that one. Thanks very much. So it gets a little hard to see. I won't ask anyone else up, but you can see we've got some really different weighting. Person number 1 was very low on evangelism, but who was that? Really low on evangelism, pretty high on the ethics area, pretty high on doing what you're made to do and understanding of calling, and not quite as high on really having the resources of the faith to undergird your work in every way. Then we have another one really strong in evangelism and not so strong in, let's see, where's your weakest one, Chris? Probably in the enrichment side, right? We have 2 people that are sort of lower in the enrichment side. When I was working in California, I didn't have many Christians in the company, but we had a lot of people that went away on some sort of a New Age, TM kind of weekend. You know, they'd go away and they'd come back restored and ready to work the next week. And somehow our churches have lost that connection to the extraordinary resources of our faith to sustain and nurture and enrich us in our work. Really, really weak in most of the faith and work ministries here. Maybe prayer, but very little sense that there's anything that my faith, the Christian faith, has to offer me in terms of enriching, or in terms of enrichment, in nurturing me as a person that's working in the world. Evangelism, some of you, how many people had a strong evangelism side? So there's some pretty established ministries that are equipping you how to evangelize in some way in your workplace. But you've either sort of had that training or you haven't. I think people are either equipped and strong there and have that focus, or in New York I have people say, well, I know I'm supposed to evangelize at work, but that's not my gift. And so it was sort of, well, there's nothing else for them to do that's distinctive as a Christian. They're at a loss. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, with the evangelism piece really quickly, if you're a remote worker, like, so the world is more, I work in technology, so it's
Right.
a lot more remote. Your meetings are quick and to the point. You're not, you're at home. So
Right.
how do you do, I don't know how to do that, or how, so like
Right.
the office is higher, now than not, it's lower.
It's far,
Yeah.
it's much more transactional
Yeah.
and relational in
Yeah.
here. Which I'm not going to directly answer your question with a how, but I am going to say, since so many jobs are moving in that direction, I think it's a significant challenge to our witness in the world. I mean, you don't have to evangelize at work. You have to evangelize somewhere.
Yeah.
So you need relationships somewhere. So if you are in that kind of a role in your workplace, it may mean that you just need to find other avenues in your
Outside
life,
of work,
outside
right.
of your workplace. It's not like we're checking off the box saying must evangelize at work, but it's David Miller's point in doing this research was people just tended to focus on one of these four things, and very little was, even the ministry itself was focused on one of these things. You rarely went to a businessman's breakfast and had them talk about their need for enrichment. Businessmen, they're strong and they can do it all themselves. They might pray and be blessed, but that's not enrichment. That was just God's supernatural blessing on them. And the calling kind of ministry, how many of you have had a high equipping in that area of discerning your calling? Oh, a lot of hands there. That's amazing. That's great. But even then, a lot of the Christian discipleship in the area of calling is heavily oriented to a secular perspective of training on calling. Find your gifts, find the need, and go do it. As opposed to sometimes God calls you to the last place you want to be. Sometimes God calls you to a real mess, and it doesn't mean He didn't call you because you're not happy about it. Our challenge as Christians is to find joy in the work that He calls us to because He called us to it, not because it's this. I personally hate speaking in front of people. I tense up. It's like, you couldn't possibly be calling me to this, Lord, because I bite off my husband's head a week before I have to speak. I'm just a horrible person. But I don't think it means that I'm not called to it. It means that I actually need some deep behavior change in terms of how I had to treat my husband when I'm having anxiety. And so we really need some, I think in all of these areas, we need a retouch to our theological grounding of how God wants to use us in those areas. So I use this kind of a matrix as a conversation starter. I had a group of educators at one point, and they wanted to have a group, but nobody could agree on what they wanted because one teacher just needed a prayer group because she was teaching in the inner city and it was so hard. And another teacher felt called to renew the entire New York City school system. She was all about, how do I change the world? And another was like, well, how do I evangelize when I'm supposed to be teaching evolution in my science class? And so, they just couldn't agree. And I would bring this in and say, you know what, we're going to do all these things. This is a mix of all of this. Yes.
This is the lost outside the box.
That's right.
When I see that XY thing, geometry trig, whatever. Have you ever thought of that image in terms of, positive and negative? Is there a potential relationship, I guess, between your y-axis beginning and ending versus your x?
Well, actually, I was lazy, and he does it in boxes. So he really talks about it as his foursquare, which sort of helps you not immediately go to the axis kind of thing.
Sure.
So no, I don't think there's a sort of a push-pull tension.
So then ethics is not opposition to the angles of ethics.
I do not think so. I think it's just dimensions and a way to map that. So the last 2 pages in that handout are a questionnaire that I use sort of as a focus group when I'm trying to get people together to say, well, what is it you would like to see in faith and work ministry? And, as a leader, the best thing to do is to get the people that you are hoping you'll be leading involved in what the movement that you're trying to lead. So this is a good way to get that conversation started. So it's just a bunch of questions in this area of ethics or enrichment or evangelism or calling on, how do you think the people around you are doing in those areas? And they do, in fact, go a little deeper as you, the higher number of points you have in those questions, the deeper you're going into that particular area. So I offer that as a tool that you can use to get a conversation going, to just get some sort of discussion started in that arena. But this is just more of a sociological tool in thinking about how to structure or lead it. The key is, how does the gospel change all of that? And how do you look in whatever your particular situation is to what parts of the people's life that you're working with that is in a closet, protected and untouched by the gospel? What part of their work life are they holding on to and not even wanting to open the door and look at it themselves? And that's really the core of the ministry. It's an avenue into discipleship that really is rich and often hidden as people are growing in their relationship with Jesus. So it's got a lot of potential. I also just a last word on that, and then we probably don't have time for questions, but I'll stay if you want to. Last word is, it's probably the biggest opportunity to draw in people who don't go to church. This conversation, especially in the area of, what should I be doing? How do I get more meaning in my work? And what should I be doing with the talents that I have? Even if I don't think those talents are from God, something deep in me knows that I have the gifts and they should be used for something worthwhile. So I think that discussions, conversations, seminars, workshops on this area of calling and meaning are rich opportunities for conversation, opening the door for people who would not otherwise put their foot inside of a church. So, any questions quickly before we,
You mentioned the question about how a lot of young people are miserable at work because they're doing grunt work, right? And you kind of gave a perspective of as bosses being able to delegate authority and all that. But what would you talk to the actual young person? Because we have also a church.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the job of the young person is to see how their little piece of the pie that feels like grunt work connects to the whole. Mm-hmm. And rarely, as a boss, do people come to me and say, just so I can get a better sense of why I'm doing this, can you explain how it fits in the whole? And when that happens, I'm joyous. Like somebody actually wants to talk to me about how their work contributes to the whole. Yeah, let's spend some time talking about that. So I think that's the number one thing. Help make, and not just the whole of the company succeeding, but the end customer. How is what you're doing joining together with lots of what other people are doing so that this end customer's problem is getting solved? I felt like I had a culture shift in whatever company I was leading, when people at the so-called water cooler would talk about how our customers' problems were getting solved. Then I felt like we were actually moving in the right direction in terms of, really caring about whether we were helping the world get better or making it worse. And the more people that could connect with that end mission, even though it took a lot of time to make all those links, is part of it. And every now and then you'll hear somebody talk that's, had some really low-level job, and they'll say, hey, I put that stone in the building that made this gorgeous skyscraper, and they get a sense of joy out of that. And the more that we can help people cultivate that sense of being part of this bigger, better thing, the better. Now, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you're not happy with the product that you're making, and you're frustrated that am I spending my time to produce this product that I'm actually don't think is helping the world, and that's a different scenario. Can you change that? Is there a new way to see it that maybe you're not seeing it as fully as God sees it? But that's a different kind of scenario. Thank you.
If we've already read Everyday Endeavor, in addition, what would you suggest on this topic to go a little deeper into it?
Yeah, and if you go to the faithandwork.com website, which is the Center for Faith and Work website, I do believe they have quite a number of resources. I love Al Walter's Creation Regained. That's sort of a book that we assign all the time. My brain is busy. Anything by Paul Stevens out of Regent College. Andy Crouch, Culture Making. Really, really good. Are those new titles to you, or are those ones you aware of? Okay. Yes.
Hey, conversations of Christians. So you talked about the kind of broader cultural ejector seat of quitting. I think like in a Christian context, there might be a similar ejector seat to ministry as a higher calling, or something overtly more ethical and positive and impactful, like nonprofit work. I did both. I joined a Christian nonprofit after working in technology, secular settings. So I guess, what do you say to the unhealthy version of that, where it's kind of like an ejector seat reflex?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we could sort of define calling to, we do it on the mission field. We say, oh yeah, to go to this heathen country and not have any water, that's a higher calling somehow than being a missionary in a really nice suburb in Chicago. But we don't do it with the workplace. I think, some of the harder workplaces are the places that we should be asking Christians to go into and celebrating that they're going into them and nurturing them more as they go into that. So I used to, when I was in Silicon Valley and there was the big internet boom and there was another millionaire minted every day, there were often I would just think, all right, God, you've got my tent pitched at the gates of hell, because there's a sense of danger around that much idolization of money, that it kind of like if you were in a casino in Las Vegas. I mean, it has that kind of feeling, and that when that's where you're called, you've got to be extra grounded, extra tight with God at that time, because you're being called into greater brokenness and greater temptation. And so I think we should honor that and celebrate